Now that we've covered a lot of the overview about what academics and gamers both have to say, we can begin to discuss how male-dominated spaces operate. To understand how male-dominated spaces operate, let's discuss the relationship between culture, language, privilege, and how these things both actively and passively contribute to misogyny. To understand a culture, we need to understand the people in that culture, which means in order to understand games, we need to understand gamers. I'll discuss the implications of the term gamer in part 5, but for now I'm going to use gaming fans as a substitute. First, I have to talk about language. This is going to get obnoxiously convoluted, but I promise I'll try to make it easy to understand. The way that human thought works, as we understand it, sort of requires language. Basically, how we learn to even be people involves learning language. In order to learn, for example, English, first we imitate the sounds of words, then we start to slowly pick up on what they mean, and this process continues until we're no longer just imitating people, but instead speaking of our own accord. Our personalities are shaped by this process as we develop a separate sense of self from others through growing to understand the words that people use around us. In order to even think at all the way we do, we first need to learn the words to be able to think that way. We develop the ability for advanced thoughts through understanding the meaning of language and developing the ability to both say words and think them, and understand what doing both means. If language is the foundation of individual thought, then culture is the foundation of societal thought. If we see a society as just a big collection of people, then culture is the collective personality of that group of people. It's our society's collective patterns of thought, behavior, values, rules, laws, norms, and so on. If a society could speak, culture would be the language of that speech. Even though language can help us expand our knowledge and our perception of the world, and is even really necessary to participate in society at all, language also, in both temporary and permanent manners, limits our ability to perceive reality. An example is the phrase, "evolution is just a theory." There are multiple conflicting definitions of the word theory, where in a colloquial sense of the word theory basically means an opinion or a guess. In the scientific sense of the word theory means a predictive model or framework for interpreting and testing data. A theory in a scientific sense is something substantiated by facts, and used to understand why they are facts and how we should anticipate data going into the future. Because people had the colloquial version in their head as the prevailing definition of a theory, creationists exploited this misunderstanding to try to imply that scientific theories were, in fact, synonymous with complete guesswork. These kinds of things, of course, can be unlearned. I myself am a prime example, as I used to believe that rhetoric back when I was a teenager until the language barrier was pointed out and resolved by skeptical-minded folks. I'm going to cite a quote from Dale Spender in the introduction to her book, Man-Made Language, a book that discusses the relationship between language and male dominance. She speaks about language in the intro. The rules for meaning, which are part of language, are not natural. They were not present in the world and merely awaiting discovery by human beings. On the contrary, they had to be invented before anything could be discovered, for without them there is no frame of reference, no order, no possibility for systematic interpretation and understanding. Once made, however, these rules have a habit of becoming self-validating and self-perpetuating, regardless of many misapprehensions on which they may have initially been based. Although it is not possible to begin at the beginning and to identify the forces which were at work in the construction of these rules to determine whether or not they were accurate or justified, it is possible to analyze the contemporary classification system of our language and to speculate on the origins and the reasons for these rules, which now play such a vital role in the construction of our worldview. Language and culture are not separate concepts. Language is a part of culture, and culture is how language is created and sustained. So if we view language as being able to limit our perception, we should also be willing to examine how culture can do the same thing. A very great example is Santa Claus. Most adults don't believe in Santa, but many children genuinely do at some point. For any children watching, plug your ears, but Santa Claus isn't real. The concept is taught to us, and before we learn the concept of Santa Claus, we can never really believe in him. So the act of learning the concept and simultaneously being taught that he is a real thing and not just a cultural myth that we tell children, leads to the idea being constructed in children's minds that Santa is, in fact, real. Culture frames Santa to children as a real thing, and so children then start to behave in a way that suggests that he's real. In this sense, culture can shape our behaviors, our thoughts, our beliefs, regardless of whether or not we know it's happening, and regardless of whether or not the thing shaping our beliefs and behaviors has any substantiated basis. Santa Claus isn't real, but the cultural language that portrays him as real allows a lot of children to be affected by their false perception, specifically a false perception that was written into their thoughts by the outside force of the culture around them. Interesting side note, I was never raised to believe that Santa Claus is real, so I never had to have the disappointing realization that parents just make him up to get children excited for Christmas. It's not even remotely a stretch to see that we as individuals essentially can't exist without the social interaction required to develop a unique social sense of self. Without the society around us, we can't develop a language, which means we can't grow our understanding to the advanced levels necessary to participate in society. It's only through the process of becoming a member of society that we can meaningfully exist as individuals. As such, while we do eventually develop a unique sense of self with a unique perspective, unique beliefs, unique behaviors, and so on, culture plays a large part in shaping our thoughts and beliefs and behaviors towards a certain path, and we will always defy that path in some ways and follow that path in other ways, oftentimes unknowingly. The reason why I say all of this is because the bigger picture is the framework through which we grow to understand anything at all, and it's also how we begin the process of understanding what the hell we're looking at when it comes to any cultural practice or value. As such, we can never fully divorce ourselves from the rest of the picture. We can disassociate from elements of a culture that we belong to, but we are still shaped by a culture even if it's by contrast. So let's bring this back to gaming culture. I don't consider myself a quote-unquote part of gaming culture, but that is a disassociation from toxic elements of the culture. I can never fully disassociate from my participation in the culture. See, I did play games growing up, and I still occasionally play games today. I'm not representative of gaming culture as a whole. I'm not indicative of what you might call the platonic form of the gamer, but I still engaged in playing games. What this means is that I played with other people, I talked about games with other people, and their interactions with me means that, for them, the social language of gaming was shaped by how they perceived me. In that sense, what it means to be a part of gaming culture, for the people who played games with me, will be shaped by those interactions. This is how, in some small way, I am part of the bigger picture. Similarly, I know people who have never played video games, and who do not participate in the culture, and as outsiders, my perspective on the culture frames for them, in some way, what the culture is. This is how we, as individuals, can shape the culture, but in turn, the culture also shapes us. Going back to what I said about how language can actually limit our perception and how culture can construct false realities, we can recognize how the interaction that people have with gaming culture can, like Santa Claus from before, shape our understanding of the world around us, such that we either don't see things that are there or do see things that aren't. Similarly, just like the mixed up meanings of the word theory can create faulty perception, so can the culture and language of gaming. The antidote to this, I believe, is proper assessment and analysis, recognizing where, when, and how these things operate, and more specifically, how these things can create problems and what to do to resolve them. A lot of the time, people tend to distance themselves from thinking about wider social trends and their implications, and try to act as though any individual circumstance or behavior is a product of individual choice and responsibility. And while we should be willing to hold individuals accountable, we have to recognize that cultural forces have relevance. Everyone is willing to recognize this sometimes. Even anti-feminists, who I'll always argue are really more akin to conspiracy theorists than an actual legitimate political group, will often appeal to wider social or cultural forces as influences on behavior and thought, but they often do it from a completely unsubstantiated starting point. So what does this all have to do with male dominance? Well, you see, the culture in the West at large is a patriarchal society, because the social language that we develop is one that emphasizes the power and authority of men over everyone else, and this idea is then used as the starting point through which we engage with the culture around us. There's a pervasive idea in our society of men being stronger, more powerful, smarter, more courageous, more logical, and by extension of all of these things, more naturally fit for holding cultural and systemic power. power, more deserving, and more inevitably going to retain this power. This becomes ingrained as the natural order when really it's the social order. This idea of patriarchy as natural order is our Santa Claus, the cultural myth that we collectively sustain through both learning and teaching the myth as though it were a reality. Pulling from man-made language again, here's another relevant quote. It appears to be part of the human condition to attempt to make existence meaningful, but we can only make sense of the world if we have rules by which to do it. We need to know what information to select, how to piece it together, and what interpretation to impose upon it. And the rules which each culture evolves for making sense of the world form the basis for these decisions. As we use these rules, we confirm their validity. We make them come true. Our results depend on the program we begin with. As we pattern, select, and interpret on the premise that males are superior, and of course, concomitantly, that females are inferior, we construct a view of the world in which males continue to be seen as superior, and females continue to be seen as inferior, thereby perpetuating the myth and reinforcing the justification for male power. The biggest misunderstanding when non-feminists and anti-feminists hear the word patriarchy is that they assume that it's referring to a conspiratorial state of affairs when it really isn't. Patriarchy is more of a mindset, and the mindset is taught. It's a culturally ingrained notion of what is seen as an ideal social order. It's similar in that sense to any political system, like feudalism, for example. Feudalism is a now outdated political system, but it was, at the time, something that people were raised into, and it was conceptualized at the time as being the natural social order or the ideal social order, because people were raised under a feudalist mindset. For noblemen, the feudalist mindset was beneficial, because it was one in which they would always be comfortable and secure. But when you recognize the cost of peasants and slaves, feudalism eventually collapsed in on itself, with moments like the French Revolution being a prime example of such a collapse. Feudalism was both a system and a culture, in the sense that the system was perpetuated by a social mindset and language that framed itself in such a way that feudalism was seen as the best or inevitable option. It's just the way things were meant to be, or so they thought. In the modern day, socio-political issues are much more complex than that, and instead of viewing things as one overarching system that dominates all underneath it, it's better to view things as interweaving systems and cultures that impact one another in various ways. The concept of a patriarchy is a reference to the cultural mindset that favors the domination of men and subordination of women, non-binary people, and yes, even sometimes other men. This is true of US culture, and that's something that can be easily measured in numerous ways, but it's also true of gaming culture. Going back to that statistic, 78% of people in the gaming industry are men, which means that statistically, men are favored in the gaming industry, and similarly, women form around 41% of the audience for games, so men are favored in the demographics of gaming consumers. This is constructed as being inevitable or natural or acceptable, as some of the respondents to my survey pointed out, but it's really not, and that's what I'd like to talk about in much more detail. Because men dominate both game development and game consumption, what this means is that men play the biggest role in constructing the social language of gaming. Just as I, as an individual, was able to make a small impact on the way that friends of mine might perceive the social experience of gaming, men in the industry and in the audience will have a very large impact in how everyone within gaming perceives the social experience of gaming. This has many consequences, none of which are very fun. The first is that men will control both the input and output of gaming, meaning that games by and for men will be prioritized, and will also be the measurements through which we meaningfully understand gaming at large, where even though we have such a wide variety of titles as Katamari Damacy, Eco, The Beginner's Guide, The Witness, Thomas Was Alone, Her Story, What Remains of Edith Finch, and so on, the games that will represent gaming as a whole will inevitably be games like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. These are also the games that will make the most money and thus have the highest budget, which then causes the flow of gaming to support producing basically the same types of games over and over again. The second is that men control the socio-political images presented in games, meaning they control things such as gender representation for a large bulk of the gaming audience. I'll address this in more detail in part 7, but what this means is that men control things like, for example, how women are portrayed in games, which in turn affects how people who play these games will perceive some aspect of women or womanhood. The third is that men dominate the way in which everyone who is a participant in gaming culture will experience both the culture itself and themselves as a part of the culture. An example of this would be, well, just about everyone who I surveyed who disassociated from the label of gamer. My mom's perception of herself as a participant in gaming culture is made extremely distant because she recognizes that the culture is defined by the way that men dominate it. The fourth is that men control the social space of gaming at large, meaning that men at large will be able to affect, to some degree, who does and does not play games, and who is and is not welcome in gaming spaces, which usually means people of color, LGBTQ people, and women. On that last point, it's worth noting that in part 2 of this video, I covered the study Generic Processes in the Reproduction of Inequality. In that study, they discussed 4 processes that help reproduce inequality, including maintaining boundaries, managing emotions, forcing subordinates to adapt to circumstances, or drop out. My mother and I are both examples of people dropping out rather than dealing with the bigger issue of having to contend with gaming culture's masculinized standards. I'd assume this is relatively common for women in the industry and in the market. But there's more to it. And maintaining boundaries plays a very, very large role in the reproduction of inequality in the gaming world. Because as participants in gaming culture, the social language of gaming that we use helps to sometimes reaffirm the idea of a quote-unquote natural order of male dominance within the subculture of gaming. This is because we all become so used to participating in the culture as is that we pick up on beliefs and behaviors that align with a male-centric perspective. The reality of gaming is framed through the male gaze. And so to pick apart why this is an issue, we first have to piece together what the issue actually is by picking apart how it operates. In part 5, I'll discuss precisely that.